Today, can a deal be done on nurses' pay? What next for independence after Nicola Sturgeon? And are some religious views a barrier to high office? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the Conservative MP, Danny Kruger, Scottish National Party MP, Alison Fewlis, Keir Starmer's former Director of Communications, Ben Nunn, and Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday. Today, the Nurses' Union suspends next week's strike action for intensive talks with the government. Can a deal be done?
I am announcing my intention to step down as First Minister and leader of my party.
What does Nicola Sturgeon's departure mean for the road to independence?
I am a practising Christian. Marriage is between a man and a woman.
Are religious views an obstacle to high political office?
Sweep away the dogma. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime.
Keir Starmer brings back a new Labour slogan. Is channeling Tony Blair the right political strategy? And we'll bring you Prime Minister's questions at noon. Let's start with the headline news here in the BBC. Online, nurses set for intensive talks with government after strike pause. That's next week's strike, following the news that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, had intervened in terms of the nurses' dispute over pay. So the opening question for my panel of guests is, can an agreement be reached with nurses over pay, Danny?
Well, I think it needs to be. There is enormous sympathy across the country and in the government for nurses. They've done such a heroic job for so long, and particularly in recent years. The challenge is that their union started this negotiation with an unacceptably high demand.
That was the 5%, above inflation.
Well, above inflation, so adding up to, getting on for 19%. So
what would be acceptable?
Well, indeed. So the government today is in talks with the union. It would be inappropriate and, in fact, impossible for me to comment because I don't know what the nature of that discussion is. But I think the fact that they're getting around the table now is constructive.
Right, but they should at least have an offer, and they are talking about pay. Was that a mistake that they hadn't beforehand?
Well, no, it's right that the public sector pay is set by the independent body. Ultimately, the taxpayer is the employer, and so at the right moment, I can understand why the government steps in. But fundamentally, this does need to start with an independent process, which is what happened.
Alison, do you think an agreement can be reached with nurses over pay?
Well, I would hope so, because we've got to that stage in Scotland, I hope, and Unison and the RCN are recommending to their members that they accept the Scottish Government's Agenda for Change pay offer, which is a 6.5% pay rise to 160,000 NHS staff in Scotland. So that's been the product of a lot of negotiation. The government has been working very hard on that. The Health Secretary's been working very hard on that.
But you've also had a fairly long-running dispute here too over the issue of pay.
We have, but I think it's been more constructive, is what I pick up, than the dispute here, where you've had government ministers actively going out and bringing in legislation like the anti-strikes bill as well, which has not helped to calm tensions within all of the professions that are in negotiation just now.
Would 6.5% be something that you would consider reasonable?
Well, it's not right for me to set what I think should be the target. The fact is that private sector wage inflation has been at around 5%. Anything above that has to be justified in terms of, is it the right thing for the country as a whole? I completely sympathise with why nurses are requesting more, and they have all my sympathy, but this does need to be considered in the context of the wider economy and the people who will be paying for these above inflation pay rises.
Do you think an agreement is going to be reached with nurses over pay?
I suspect eventually it will be, yes. I think there will, because I think there has to be actually some credit to the RCN in which the way they've handled these negotiations. But what I don't understand why the government's only now going into talks. That offer to suspend the strikes, if talks happened, was made several weeks ago and the government didn't do it. So the fact that the government is now finally talking is a good thing. But I think it's harmed them politically, because I think there is a huge amount of support out there for nurses. And at the moment, the government looks like it's on the wrong side of the argument.
Do you think they are a special case, if you like, in terms of the government? As everyone has said, the nurses, there are lots of other unions and sectors taking strike action. Is this also a case of the government picking off the RCN, the Royal College of Nurses?
I think what's certainly true is that nurses are the most sympathetic of those going on strike. There's huge public support for them, and I think that this intensification of negotiations suggests that, yeah, potentially they are a special case. There could be a landing zone where you sort of backdate some of this extra pay. Without getting into the weeds, because we're not in the negotiating room, I do think that politically it's far harder to go head-to-head with nurses, particularly post-pandemic, than, say, trained staff that aren't willing to reform.
Right, and as you say, the government had insisted they wouldn't reopen or look at pay for this year that we're in or just ending, but it looks as if they are reopening those particular talks. Yeah. You also heard in the headlines, Nicola Sturgeon there, Scotland's First Minister, the shock announcement by her last week that she has decided to step down. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
I am firmly of the view that there is now majority support for independence in Scotland. But that support needs to be solidified, and it needs to grow further if our independent Scotland is to have the best possible foundation. To achieve that, we must reach across the divide in Scottish politics. And my judgment now is that a new leader will be better able to do this. Someone about whom the mind of almost everyone in the country is not already made up, for better or worse.
What did you do when you first heard that news? I mean, I practically fell off my chair.
I mean, I was already on the floor hearing the news. I was absolutely devastated at her stepping down. She's been an exceptionally strong First Minister in Scotland. And I hope that she is right and that movement will come on, because the movement is much bigger than just one person. That's always been the case.
Right. You say it's bigger than one person. I mean, do you think she found herself at a dead end when it came to your core mission, her core mission, which is to have an independent Scotland and that second independence referendum? She just couldn't do it.
I don't believe so, no. I think if you listen to the entirety of your speech and if you look back over the past 8 years, there have been a number of pressures that have been on her, very intense pressures, not just the pressures of being First Minister, which is a huge job, but you've had the COVID pandemic and you've had everything else. In addition to that, she's been subject to constant scrutiny, constant abuse on social media, and that's a lot to bear. You know, to do that for 8 years, every single day, getting up and doing that job. I don't know anybody who could do that in the way that she has done over that time through the pandemic and everything else.
Right.
She's been incredible, and she's done a huge amount for our cause in that time. And I think, as she reflected, we're now at 50% pretty much consistently in the polls for independence.
Right, but it's pretty divided, and it has been. She'd just reached the end of the road, hadn't she, on independence? She just wasn't going to get there. That's why she quit.
I don't believe so, no. I don't believe so. I think had she wanted to continue, she would have certainly had my support, the support of the party to do so, because she is an exceptional leader. She has taken Scotland to the world as well, and it was quite interesting. I found some of the reflections and the comments were coming from international commentators and political leaders from around the world on her stepping down.
Well, if she's so exceptional, and there was Alex Salmond obviously before her, and they couldn't get another referendum, who on earth can?
Well, I very much hope that whoever the party chooses as the next leader will be able to achieve that. Because if you think about where independence was when Alex Salmond first took over, when Nicola Sturgeon took his place after the 2014 referendum, it has been an up and up and up over that time. Well, we're in a very different position now than we were 8 years ago or 16 years ago.
Yes, but it's true. You're in a different position because certainly it became very much a core centre of politics in general in the UK. But actually, in terms of support, it is still split. Scotland has been split since then. And in fact, her latest suggestion was to make the next general election a de facto referendum on independence. Do you support that?
I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take in the absence of the UK government recognising the democratic right of the Scottish people to choose their own future. Because we have now had 8 elections that Nicola Sturgeon has won over this piece. All of those have elected SNP to various levels of government. And the UK government has refused to acknowledge that democratic right. So if the expression of Scotland's future is not able to be put in a referendum, as we ideally would like to have, we have to think about what other routes are available to us. And that is the first available route would be the next Westminster election.
I mean, it is true. It's just because you've been blocking it continually.
Well, the fact is that there is not a consistent majority for independence in Scotland. The support seems to have reached a natural ceiling now. There was a definitive, once-in-a-generation referendum only 7 years ago. We can't keep on having referendums every time the SNP...
9 years ago.
Every time the SNP requests it. And the fact is, I mean, I think Alison's right. Independence is bigger than one individual, but it does look like Nicola Sturgeon was exhausted, totally understandably, by the demands of the role, but also by the unescapable fact that the SNP has not been able to convince sufficient majority of the Scottish people how independence will actually work. And it has now reached its natural ceiling. And I think we need to concentrate on delivering for the people of Scotland, which the SNP government consistently fails to do because of their obsession with constitutional change.
Alison?
I mean, that's demonstrably not true. I mean, we've got a nursing dispute continuing here. The nursing dispute almost at the point of being resolved in Scotland. We are getting on with that job. We also have the best paid NHS staff in all 4 NHSs in the United Kingdom as well. So we are getting on with that day job. And if you want to talk about constitutional wrangling, the Tories have a bit of a cheek given the mess of Brexit and all that has happened as a result of that.
Well, that was the result of a referendum that we actually won. So that's when constitutional change.
We won that in Scotland. 62% of people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU.
It was a UK vote.
I mean, in terms of Labour, were you cheering when Nicola Sturgeon announced that she was stepping down, since Labour hasn't actually managed, or Keir Starmer hasn't managed to make any inroads in terms of electoral support in Scotland thus far?
I wasn't cheering. I disagree with nearly everything Nicola Sturgeon stands for, and I think her record in government has not been good, and I think her project of independence is flawed. However, she's an incredible politician, and I think she is one of the most impressive politicians in this country since Tony Blair, actually. I mean, she carries herself incredibly well. She grabs onto the public mood very, very well, and I think she is a loss to the SNP and the Yes movement. Her departure is a loss for the SNP and the Yes movement.
And a huge gain for Labour, potentially?
A huge opportunity. Anyone who says it's a gift, anyone who says it's all priced in is wrong. It's a huge opportunity. That's how it should be treated. Because as you were saying, you know, Labour has struggled in Scotland since the referendum, since 2015. There is now space for Scottish Labour to say, look, we are credible in England and Wales. You know, there is a chance of a Labour government, a Labour majority government for the first time in more than a decade. Give us a chance. And that is a more compelling message than Labour's been able to put out there in a number of years.
Yeah, I mean, what do you say, Alison? I mean, this is a headline in The Guardian. Keir Starmer tells SNP voters Labour will shift power from London. It is, to some extent, a gift to Labour, isn't it?
I mean, Labour Party have been saying this kind of stuff about shifting power forever. And I don't believe that will actually happen, because that has not been what Labour have been about. You've also got Labour sort of misreading the mood of the public in Scotland as well. You've got Anna Sarwar saying Labour candidates cannot support independence. Well, lots of Labour supporters do support independence. And by denying Labour voters that option to vote for Scotland's future, they're basically writing off those votes, and they will not be able to attract those votes. And the reality of it is also that if you, even at the last election, if Labour had won every single seat in Scotland, it still wouldn't have been enough to form a government. What you have with the SNP is the opportunity to have strong representation and a strong Scottish voice in Westminster, and that cannot be guaranteed by the Labour Party.
I think, firstly, what Anas is trying to do, and he's right to do this, he's basically saying, look, it's not about... Most people anywhere in the country, whether you're in Scotland, Wales, you know, or England, your first priority isn't constitutional reform. It is, how good's my NHS? How good are my schools? How safe are my streets? And I think Anas is rightly trying to say, look, those are the issues that matter most to me, because they matter most to people in Scotland. On the point about, you know, if Labour had won every seat in Scotland, it still wouldn't form a majority. I think that's right, but I think what's crucial now, and the huge opportunity, not a gift, but a huge opportunity now, is that Labour looks credible in England and Wales for the first time in many, many years. And that is a strong stance for Anas to be able to go, and Keir to go up to Scotland and say, look, we can get a majority now. there is a real chance for a majority Labour government, and therefore there is a vote that's worth giving.
What about Rishi Sunak? Because Conservatives may have cheered Nicola Sturgeon's announcement, but there are plenty of Conservative MPs, I don't know if Danny is one of them, but some of those that I've spoken to who do feel it's more of an opportunity for Labour than it is for the Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, Ben might not have been cheering, but I think I could hear the champagne corks popping from Westminster from the Labour offices. Look, it's good for unionists, right, because it is, like it or not, a massive setback for the independence movement, I think. Nicola Sturgeon came to symbolise that, a very charismatic politician. She's now gone. They're navel-gazing about who will follow, and inevitably that's going to damage them in the polls. I think it is a much bigger opportunity for Labour. That's what all the pollsters tell me anyway. But it's important to remember that while Labour's about to kind of go on this love-bombing mission of Scotland, it's theirs to lose as well. They're going to have to prove that they're still relevant there. They want to get about a dozen seats is their estimate at the next election. And it will, we'll all be excited and interested to see if they actually manage to capitalise in those cities like Glasgow.
All right, well, let's talk about the race to replace Nicola Sturgeon, because it has already very much kicked off. Let's go to Edinburgh and talk to our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon. Hello to you. Lorna, who's in the running?
Got 3 candidates who've declared so far. Of course, nominations don't close until midday on Friday, but the 3 people who've thrown their hats into the ring are Humza Yousaf, Ash Regan and Kate Forbes. Quick potted history on all 3 of them. Ash Regan, of course, resigned from the Scottish Government just before Christmas over that controversial gender recognition reform bill. She has yet to speak in depth about her views, despite repeated requests, but she has said she'll make herself available for interviews at some point. She has also been clear that she fully supports equal marriage. Humza Yousaf's the health minister up here. He insists his faith does not dictate how he legislates. He was absent for that first vote, or for the final vote on equal marriage, but supported it in the earlier stages. And then there's Kate Forbes, who launched her campaign on Monday morning, saying she wanted to be open as possible about her views, or in particular on how faith interacts. That's how the questioning ended up going, and it's caused her some problems.
Yes, indeed. We'll come on to that in just a moment. What about the timetable? Just give us a brief outline.
Yeah, so nominations close on Friday. We're still to see if anyone else throws their hat into the ring. The ballot will open at noon on the 13th of March. There are around 100,000 SNP members. It'll be 1 member, 1 vote. And we'll find out on the 27th of March who's won that ballot, who'll become the leader of the SNP, and who, in effect, will become First Minister of Scotland.
Lorna, there has, as you said, been some controversy over Kate Forbes' standing as one of the candidates. I'm just going to show our viewers and our guests here in the studio some of the front pages and reaction. This is because she said she wouldn't have voted for same-sex marriage had she been there at the time. The Scottish Sun, first of all, SNP backlash shocks Forbes, panned Kate Tuesday, hardline Christian views damage her bid. If we roll on to the Scotsman and have a look at the headline, Forbes still running at the moment as campaign hit by crisis. And finally, the National. SNP staffers began to fear what she'd say next. She is the Finance Minister. What's happened here?
Launched her campaign late Monday morning. I think by late afternoon, some of her previous backers were already getting a little bit queasy about offering her their support. I think the only thing that's surprising about her position when it comes to her faith, she's very open about her Christian beliefs, and she's a member of the Free Church of Scotland. But I think the only thing that's surprising is that people are surprised about her position in some of these areas. She has said that she doesn't support the gender recognition reform bill. She has said that she would not have supported the vote on same-sex marriage, but that she wouldn't roll it back if she did become First Minister, and that she personally doesn't believe, according to her faith, that it's right to have children outside of marriage. It's caused her a lot of problems stating these positions publicly, but her intention is to fight on. She's trying to reset her campaign now, and there are suggestions she's brought in a media advisor as well.
Oh, well, that'll help. Thank you very much, Lorna Gordon there. Well, let's have a listen to part of Kate Forbes in an interview.
I am a practising Christian. I practice the teachings of most mainstream religions, whether that's Islam, Judaism, Christianity, that marriage is between a man and a woman. But that's what I practice. As a servant of democracy, in a country where this is law, I would defend to the hilt your right and anybody else's right to live and to love without harassment or fear.
Kate Forbes there. What's wrong with what she said?
Well, I think some of the difficulty that she has got herself in is to appear as if she is being judgmental. I don't think she is judgmental. I know Kate. She's been an excellent finance minister. She's very, very smart. And I think she's just been slightly blindsided by some of the questioning that she's had here.
Has she? She doesn't seem to be blindsided. She seems to have been quite honest in her views, her religious views. Is it wrong for a politician to express the view she has then and apply for high office?
I think many people who have held high office have had religious faith, but it's about how you reconcile that faith with legislating for everybody. And I think that has been presented to her, and she has been challenged on that. And I think that is very unfortunate for Kate in the circumstances.
But just to be clear, she says she wouldn't have supported same-sex marriage. She thinks it's desirable, I paraphrase a bit, desirable for children to be born within a marriage, not out of wedlock. Are those views incompatible? Can you be First Minister of Scotland holding those views?
I mean, that is for the members of the SNP to decide, I guess. Well, I'm supporting Hamza Yusuf, who has spoken very passionately about his support for equal marriage, about his ability to reconcile his faith, which he holds very strongly, with the public office that he's held. He is Health Secretary and is supporting buffer zones around abortion centres, for example. He is able to reconcile that and is able to govern for the majority of people. I think it would be helpful, I suppose, if all politicians, reflected on how they reconcile those things.
Right. What do you make of the backlash, Danny Kruger? Because there are a number of MSPs who said they would support Kate Forbes. Maybe they didn't know about her views, but they've changed their minds and they've withdrawn it.
Well, I have great sympathy and respect for Kate Forbes, and just watching that clip now, I was struck by her clarity and her honesty, and we're always asked as politicians to give straight answers to straight questions, and she did that. And I think your line of questioning, Joe, is absolutely right just now. The fact is, it should be permissible in a liberal democracy to hold political office while also adhering to one of the great traditional faiths of this country. And I regret the fact that so many politicians are leaping to judgment. Alison suggests that she looks judgmental. I suggest it's politicians who are criticising her who are being judgmental now. Absolutely, she should be entitled to put herself forward and to lead, because she's as a practising Christian. There should not be any difficulty with that.
Alison?
As I say, I'm very much a believer in separating out church and state, and I think as First Minister, as leader of a party that is as diverse as the SNP is, you should be able to govern for everybody.
Right. I mean, she said, I would defend to the hilt to live and to love without harassment or fear. But is there an issue of trust, Danny Kruger, on issues that are often of conscience, but is there a problem for constituents and voters in Scotland who may fear that there could at some point in the future be any eroding of rights that have been passed?
Well, I think, if they don't want to vote for her because she's a Christian, then that's their absolute right. But no, I mean, the fact is, she said what her position is on gay marriage in particular. There's no suggestion that people are going to try and undo that particular law. It should be possible in a liberal democracy to have people represented from all the great faiths of the world. And I do regret it. I think we are on a very intolerant track now if we suggest that somehow her religious faith invalidates her as a politician.
I mean, is there room, Alison, in the SNP for someone holding Kate Forbes' views?
I believe there is. I mean, we've got a very diverse party from a whole range of different backgrounds, different faiths, all faiths and none. And the party has always been like that, and I hope it will always be like that. And I would certainly discourage people from, piling on or putting abuse out there into the world, because politics is difficult enough as it is without adding that to it.
Can you hold those views, Ben, and be Prime Minister, First Minister?
I think I think it's really difficult. So, firstly, I would hate that we get to a position where we're saying people of religious faith shouldn't be in our politics, and said you shouldn't run for our office. I think, as Danny said and Alison said, I think it's a terrible road for us to go down. The problem Kate Forbes has got is that it's not about her religious views, it's about the fact some of the decisions she said she would take on policy. It is the fact she said, I would vote against gay marriage. And that is more of a problem for her, because that is out of touch with where probably the vast majority of people are, and out of touch with an issue many people thought was settled in this country. So it shouldn't be about her faith. And I think if we do start going down the road of saying people of religious faith...
To be fair to her, she is saying that it's settled. She's saying she wouldn't try and undo it. She's talking about what she might have done 12 years ago. So her public position is she supports the law as it is. She's got no intention of changing anything. So I think she answered a straight question.
She did.
And I think we should honour that and not read into her all sorts of dark threats. She's clearly a straight-talking, honest person. I have no idea if she's the right candidate to lead the SNP, but I think that the row over this is very, very dangerous and unfair.
I mean, I didn't say I agree. I didn't say she wasn't answering a straight question. The problem is when she's asked, would you have voted for it in the past, she says no. And that does open up questions about, OK, well, what would you do in the future on other issues? That is the challenge she's got, because she has said that her faith would impact her voting decisions. That's the challenge that's opened up. You know, and she should be allowed to...
But everybody's faith impacts their voting decisions. The idea that people sort of somehow leave their values behind, atheists as well, and they'd make a decision based on some other set of values, of course, it's nonsense. Everybody's faith impacts their decision, including all of us. So,
but isn't that a problem? Isn't that a potential problem? Because she's sort of being asked to leave them at the door, but shouldn't people be guided by them if that's what they believe in?
Well, as I say, we all bring our values to work, whatever our metaphysical views are, and we bring those into our judgment. What I think is appropriate is that she's absolutely clarified her support for the existing framework of law, and I think it's quite right that voters should want to know about that.
How would you have voted on same-sex marriage?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I wasn't an MP then. I mean, I'm like Kate, as you might be able to detect. I'm an Orthodox Christian as well, and I adhere to the teachings of my church on these questions. So I was uncomfortable with that law when it went through, but like her, I have no intention of trying to undo it. And as Ben says, the public is absolutely in favour of it, and I think it's right that as democratic politicians we respect the will of the majority on these settled questions. Uncomfortable, but would you have voted against it? Well, as I say, I mean, I can't say definitively how I would have voted in a debate that was held 10 years ago. But, you know, as I say, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I hold to the traditional teachings of my church. And do those beliefs guide you then in the way you have just set out on other parts of policy? Well, Jo, as I'm saying, every single one of us, politicians or not, brings our values into these questions. And I think it's very wrong, and if I may challenge you, it is very wrong to suggest that people who have a metaphysical belief in God, religion, are somehow inappropriate, should not be bringing those beliefs into their... Well, I'm not. These are very much things that have been brought up by SNP members and a member of the Scottish Parliament. I mean, one of them, Richard Lochhead, has said, I mean, he was supporting Miss Forbes and then he withdrew his support. He wrote on Twitter, "We can't have a party leader who'd voted against same-sex marriage." Is he right?
But I think if you look at the kind of progress that Scotland has made in LGBT rights over many, many years, that has been hard-won battles for that community. And I think sending out a message that you're not 100% behind that community becomes problematic.
Kate?
I mean, she has the freedom, obviously you have freedom of religious thought in this country and expression. And just like you have the freedom to express those beliefs, the SNP have the freedom to reject her, as it feels like they are doing, just like the voters have the freedom to reject her, as I imagine they probably would. And the reason I think that is because I think political leaders who want to be leaders of major political parties, indeed first ministers, prime ministers, probably do have to be in sync with the cultural and social mores of the people they represent. And, you know, like it or not, she doesn't feel very in sync with that. I think my peers would be pretty concerned about somebody who's against gay marriage, against abortion, against children out of wedlock. That feels very old-fashioned. And yes, she's not talking about unpicking this legislation now. That would be kind of totally balmy, to be honest. But of course, as you quite rightly say, it shapes your legislation going forward, doesn't it? And I think that is the concern here. Right. I mean, when it comes to views in general, remember Alistair Campbell famously said something similar to, and this is Tony Blair's former head of communications, "We don't do God." Why do you think? I mean, it's still as prescient today, is it then? I think it touches... I think the argument for that touches on exactly what Kate has just said, which is the most successful political leaders are those that are seen to be in sync with the public mood. And the problem Kate has got
Kate Forbes, not Kate Ferguson.
We won't talk about you.
The problem Kate Forbes has got is she's now seen as being out of step with the public mood. That is why those arguments are made.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I mean, you know, people who hold to Christian values are out of step with the public mood. I mean, they always have been. That's what being a Christian involves. But, you know, yes, it used to be true that the kind of official culture of the country used to be more Christian. But, you know, that's democratic life. I don't accept, by the way, and I do recognise Kate's point, she's right, you know, political leaders have to be in sync. I'm not sure it's necessarily the case that the public would you know, despise the suggestion that we need stronger families, that it's good for children to be brought up in stable homes, it's good for couples to stay together, and that it's appropriate for the government to try and reinforce couple stability and family stability. You know, the fact is that government does interfere with family life through its tax system, through the benefit system. So I think it's appropriate to think, are we helping or not? But what we can't do, and what we must never do as politicians, is to be judgmental of other people. That is not our job. It's not our job as an individual, not my job as a Christian to judge anybody else. But it is appropriate for the government to think, what kind of society are we helping to make through our decisions here? And I think a government who decides to try and strengthen families and support children to grow up well is quite appropriate.
Alison, would you like to see Kate Forbes stay in this race?
I mean, she says she will, and that's a decision entirely up to her. But there's certainly a lot of pressure on her now as a result of the comments that she has made. So whether or not she does, I don't know. But we've only got until Friday, so we'll see what happens.
Yes, not long to wait. Let's have a look at this headline in The Sun. In your paper, tough on crime. You'll remember that slogan, tough on the causes of crime. Labour will introduce new look ASBOs, antisocial behaviour orders, to crack down on louts inflicting misery on their communities. It's your story. Tell us about it.
Yes, so this is a new announcement by Labour. It was the culmination of Crime Week, their big blitz of policy announcements telling you how they're going to crack down on crime. This is Keir Starmer totally being heir to Blair, right? Straight out of the playbook. In fact, he's borrowed one of Blair's most famous policies, ASBOs. He wants to bring back ASBOs. He's going to call them respect orders. They're going to be even tougher than the old ASBOs, apparently. So these are targeted at adults who repeatedly are guilty of antisocial behaviour. And if you breached one of these new respect orders, you could be taken to court and thrown into jail.
What do you make of it?
It's absolutely right area Labour needs to be on. New Labour, new ASBOs. I think it's totally right. But on the kind of tough on crime, on that as a slogan, it was more than a slogan. It was an important argument. The argument Blair was making then, and absolutely right now, is if you invest in prevention, you can therefore reduce crime in the longer run. So it's a sustained argument, and I think that's why it's sustained the length of time.
Is there a problem with channelling Tony Blair as much as Keir Starmer is doing with this particular policy?
No. There is more of a problem which Labour has done over the last 10 years, which is criticise Labour in power. The Labour Party, certainly in recent years, not since Keir, but in years before that, used to spend much of the time talking about how all the things Labour did when it was in power which were wrong, and basically saying to the public, don't forget we're not very good. That was a totally ridiculous approach. So you're much better on saying, look, these are the arguments that worked then and they work now.
They're obviously chasing the Conservatives' mantra as being tough on crime too. The statistics show otherwise. Last year, Home Office and ONS data showed recorded crime in England and Wales was at a 20-year high, with charge rates at a new low. Hardly surprising, is it?
Yeah, well, no, and I applaud Labour's effort to try and win the crime vote, you know, the anti-crime vote. It's, you know, they're making a good move here. They're making a good move there, and if it can be made to work, great. The problem is Labour have voted consistently against Conservative measures to give the police greater powers, to give courts greater powers over sentencing.
But this is about something different, isn't it?
To put more funding into the police. So I think they've got a bit of an uphill struggle to convince people that they genuinely are tough on crime. But the aspiration is the right one, and I think the echo of Blair is sensible as well. I mean, it's difficult to get two messages across. I worked for David Cameron years ago, and I wrote the speech "Hug a Hoodie," and because we only got one point in the headline, which was the preventive agenda, you know, so helping young kids to get on the right road. We also had a very strong tough on crime message in that speech, but nobody reported it. So you've got to decide which you want, and I think it's right that Labour are deciding they want to have the tough on crime message. As I say, the fact is they're not living up to it, and they're voting at the moment.
But that sounds like an admission of failure by Conservative governments, then.
How's that?
Well, because, as you said, it's laudable what Labour is doing, and it's the right strategy. Does that
they have to correct a chronic brand problem that they have, that they've, for years, have been seen to be on the side of the criminal.
Rather than
and as I say, in recent years, opposing one measure after another that Conservative governments have brought forward to crack down on criminals.
Right. Do you think people won't trust you because of the legislation that's been passed or trying to be passed by a Conservative government?
I don't think we need to worry about trusting me. I think it's more the Labour Party.
I mean the Labour Party.
No, I don't. Not least because in Keir, you've got a former Director of Public Prosecution. In Yvette, you've got someone who's very well respected on the Home brief. I think you've got a very strong team at the top who I think can win over the public on this. Frankly, when you're in opposition, if you're getting distracted by what your opponents are saying about you, you're losing the argument. Make your own argument, and you can convince people better.
I mean, your constituency, Glasgow Central, Alison, has some of the highest crime rates in the UK. ASBOs are still in place, I think, in Scotland.
Quite certain that's true, but
some of the highest, or one of the highest crime rates. I mean, they don't seem to be working there, do they?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is an agenda for England, not an agenda for Labour in Scotland.
But I'm talking about antisocial behaviour orders.
That is a devolved issue. And in Scotland, we've got a very good track record of using things like violence reduction units to look at the issues that are drawing young people into crime, to try and prevent that within communities and to come up with community solutions that try and prevent that rather than being tough on crime and locking people up, because prisons are already at bursting point. Locking more people up will not resolve this problem. You need to have a more preventative approach, some of which Danny acknowledged in what he was saying in the speech he was involved in. But that preventative approach is far more important, and you need to prevent reoffending as well for those people that do end up within the criminal justice system.
So broadly, you would support what's being introduced here then by Labour?
Well, I'm not sure of the whole detail of what their policies will be on this. As I say, it's a devolved issue for Scotland. But I think locking people up and being tough on people is not necessarily the best or most effective way out of this, because it became ASBOs, I believe, became a bit of a badge of honour for young people involved in crime rather than trying to deter them. So there needs to be a lot of careful thought as to how this is done most effectively to reduce crime levels.
I mean, do you think the low-level crime issue is going to be extremely important at the election?
Yes, I think it's huge. You can see it creeping up the polls as an issue. Crime, law and order, and specifically antisocial behaviour. It inflicts misery on neighbours who live in those communities. It's often repeat offenders. Often cops don't know what they can do with them. And interestingly, I should say that Rishi Sunak's expected to unveil his big antisocial behaviour crackdown in the next few weeks. So I think you're going to see both leaders going toe-to-toe on this. So I think you'll see sort of political unity almost on needing to get tougher, and then it's for the voter really to decide which one they believe.
Right, and that would be the right strategy too.
Well, it's good to be having... This is a proper subject of politics. We genuinely have a problem with antisocial behaviour. The police funding has now increased significantly. They do have the powers. What we need to ensure is that they do their job and rid our streets and our town squares of this sort of behaviour. Well,
let's welcome viewers from the BBC News Channel. You're watching Politics Live. It's under 10 minutes until Prime Minister's questions with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer. And while we're on the subject of politics, and of course they face each other across the dispatch box, one of the things Nicola Sturgeon said in her speech when she announced she was stepping down, she spoke about the brutality of politics. She thought it got worse. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it has got worse. It's got immeasurably worse. And people seem to be prepared to say all kinds of things to you, not just online now, but in person as well, by email, all those kinds of things. And I think that does make it incredibly difficult for women, particularly in politics, because any abuse that a politician gets, for women, there's an extra layer of misogyny on top of that. For marginalised communities, for people of colour, there is a layer of racism on top of that as well. And it's very, very toxic.
Have you noticed that too, Danny? Forgive me, I can't remember how many years...
Well, I've only been in Parliament since 2019.
Yes.
And I would just echo Alison's point. She actually kindly asked me before we came on if I get much abuse. And I do, but it's standardised, Tory scum kind of, rubbish. Whereas... She's absolutely right. Particularly women, colleagues of ours, get such an absolutely unacceptable level of abuse online and I'm afraid to say in person. So something is going wrong. Social media is driving it. Our divisive politics has made it worse. And we need to be absolutely clear that it's unacceptable to berate public figures personally in the way that happens. I mean, that said, we all need to put up with a fair degree of criticism, but I do think the personalised abuse that people get, and I have every sympathy, and I can well imagine Nicola Sturgeon just had enough of it.
Right, and you think that did contribute?
I think there's a whole range of different things that contributed to her decision, but that certainly, undoubtedly, is one of them.
What do you think? Is it getting worse?
Well, everyone says it's getting worse. I imagine it's getting worse. You get a bit of it as a reporter, probably nowhere near as bad, but you still get a fair bit of it on Twitter and on email and things. I mean, I just think it's gross and depressing. And I know lots of people who are incredibly interested in politics, and actually for jobs they might go into things like charity sector. That shapes what jobs they go into. But they would balk at the idea of going into Parliament, running to be an MP, and Parliament is getting poorer for it. It's gross. I don't know how you solve it. It's a shame.
I mean, let's have a look at this. Keir Starmer in the Daily Telegraph revealing his loathing of Boris Johnson. I'm not saying this is the same thing, but were you surprised when he revealed that in the podcast he gave recently?
No. No, I saw that loathing firsthand. I mean, Keir had a huge amount of respect for Theresa May. And I think you'd say the same about Rishi Sunak. But Keir and Boris were very different characters, so I wasn't surprised one bit.
You worked for Boris Johnson at one stage. Do you think Boris Johnson loathed Keir Starmer?
No, he's not a hater. And
he's not a hater.
He attracts a lot of hate. But no, I don't think he personally despises anybody. And actually, I think that's part of his appeal. People genuinely saw him as a generous-spirited character. He had all sorts of flaws, no doubt. But no, he I don't think was filled with hate. He invited it, that's for sure. And it was a pretty depressing sight, the amount of vitriol that he got from MPs who absolutely despise him on a personal level, and I think that was a shame.
Right. I mean, is loathing the wrong word then? And bearing in mind we're talking about the sort of treatment of each other in the sort of political sphere.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. But I do agree with everything that's just been said about the politics. It has got more toxic. It is far worse for female politicians and female journalists, to be honest. And this is not a call for sympathy, but even when I was an advisor, I got abuse online and messages of hate. And it is really tough. It's really brutal. It is putting people off. I have no idea how you would stop it. I'd probably start by shutting Twitter down, but I'm not sure I'd get away with that.
Well, that's one way of doing it, but as you say, you'd be shut out of all the discourse. Now, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer went to say that he phoned me the day he became Prime Minister and gave me his personal number, and we said we would work together on things like Ukraine. Do you think that's unusual or heartening, Kate?
Yes, well, I guess quite heartening, friendship across the barricades. I guess Ukraine's a special point, right? Keir wants to make a big deal about being pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, willing to work whenever. And I think Rishi Sunak probably wants the allies where he can get them. So that's a nice thing. And Ukraine really stands totally apart from partisan politics here, doesn't it? As both leaders have made very clear.
Well, yes.
I mean, just quickly on the loathing point, I think it is regrettable. I think they should be allowed to use tough language about each other and be critical.
But people can stand up to that.
But I think that's OK. But I just would emphasise, and Kate's made the point, these politicians talk all the time. Alice and I sat next to each other for some time on a Treasury Select Committee.
And you managed it fine.
And we managed it fine. And actually, on a personal level, Gordon Brown and David Cameron used to talk. We are all human beings. We inhabit the same institution in Parliament, and actually the human relationships are pretty good. And we're all actually, for all the abuse that's going on out there, I think we're quite protected by the walls of Westminster, and actually people treat each other, I think, pretty well inside Parliament. Right, well, talking of human relationships, within the Conservative Party over the Northern Ireland Protocol and a deal that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is hoping to announce at some point this week, if not today, prevented by wings of the Conservative Party and the Democratic Unionist Party, if all the reports are to be believed. Does this show Rishi Sunak's weakness, that he's not been able to override those parts of the Conservative Party? Well, we're in the middle of a negotiation which we don't know the details of at the moment, so I think it's too early to tell. I mean, he's a very consensual politician. He wants to bring people along, and he has a challenge here, which is how to reconcile the demands of the EU with the necessity of honouring the Good Friday Agreement, which entails consent of both communities in Northern Ireland. And that's why the DUP matters so much. I think it's going to be very difficult, but the DUP have been constructive themselves, and are honouring the process that the Prime Minister is leading. And so let's see what they come up with.
But should Rishi Sunak have brought the Democratic Unionist Party on board from the beginning of these negotiations?
There's conversations all the time going on with the DUP and with all the parties in Northern Ireland, so I don't think they've been excluded.
I mean, Gavin Barwell, Chief of Staff for Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, has said it's been 7 years now. We can show you the tweets. It should be clear to everyone that there is no version of Brexit where all of the UK is free to diverge from EU rules, but the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland stays as it is today. He goes on to say you either accept a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, or you have special arrangements for Northern Ireland, or you have a soft Brexit. Which is it, Danny?
Well, I mean, one day Gavin Barwell will have to accept that the Theresa May deal didn't work, but the deal was achieved by Boris Johnson, which Gavin loathes, and we're now in a new world, which the Northern Ireland Protocol is a sort of residue of that deal. It was always understood at the time that it was a temporary arrangement.
Well,
it has
so
to be
I keep
resolved.
hearing this about it being temporary. I mean, I hadn't heard it actually at the time.
No, it was a protocol. It's not even part of the...
When your colleague Theresa Villiers was sitting here yesterday, I don't remember that being a particularly salient point when it was all signed up to.
Absolutely, it was a temporary arrangement. That's in black and white. It's always supposed to only be there for a period, and the opportunity now is before us with a genuinely goodwill, as I believe, in the EU, and a constructive attitude from the British government, and a willingness on the part of the parties in Northern Ireland to try and resolve this problem, which always was going to have to be resolved.
Right, not a big problem then. How dangerous is this for Rishi Sunak? How big a moment?
Right, I think it is quite dangerous. So Rishi obviously thinks he's got this new deal that is a massive improvement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and now he's trying to sell that to the DUP. If he can sell it to the DUP, every Tory MP pretty much will follow. So that's the key thing. And he wants to obviously bring back power sharing in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
But the danger for Rishi is that you rake over old wounds, you thrust Brexit and all those divisions back into the limelight, and you actually don't get the DUP signed up, don't bring back power sharing, and you're just sort of taking on a row that you don't need to. And it will all come down to whether or not he succeeds, I think.
Cabinet resignations over this?
Well, there's always at least one Cabinet Minister on resignation watch, isn't there?
At least...
I won't name names.
At least one. Which would Keir Starmer go for in terms of the choices laid out there by Gavin Barwell?
I think it's a difficult one to answer, to be honest.
Yes.
Nor because I think this is incredibly complex, incredibly difficult. I think Keir's done the right thing saying, look, if Rishi can get a deal...
Not saying very much about it.
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, I think what Keir's done the last couple of days by saying, look, if Rishi can get a deal with the EU...
He'll support it.
He'll back it. So I actually think that is a sign.
And that's before he knows what the deal might be.
No, but I think it's a principal point because...
I think you can stop there because we've got Prime Minister's questions.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that we are joined today by a delegation from Kyiv. This coming Friday, there will be a national moment of reflection, which will give us the opportunity to pay tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian people and demonstrate our solidarity with Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Andrew Wester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's comments with regard to the bravery of the Ukrainian people. Labour have asked his government on 3 occasions to commit to a police response to every domestic abuse call. To date, no answer has been forthcoming. Could the Prime Minister provide a response today?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just this week we announced new measures to tackle violence against women and girls. This is the government that introduced the landmark Domestic Abuse Act that's rolling out specialist advisors for those who suffer and putting more funding to support victims. We will continue to do everything we can to make sure that women and girls are safe everywhere in our country.
Andrew Sulu.
The warm welcome given to Ukrainian refugees by so many is extremely heartwarming. Does the Prime Minister understand, though, how upset my constituents are to have bookings for weddings and other special family events cancelled when the Home Office took over a much-loved hotel? And will he redouble his efforts to put an end to this practice?
Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friends, constituents, and indeed the whole country can be proud of the welcome that they have given to people from Ukraine over the last year. And I can assure him that we are committed to reducing the number of asylum seekers living in hotels at vast cost to taxpayers and considerable disruption to communities. I'm grateful to the leadership of the Home Secretary and the Immigration Minister in finding a sustainable solution, and the Home Secretary will make a formal update in the coming weeks on progress in standing up alternative sites for accommodation.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Ukraine? I had the privilege last week of seeing firsthand the courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people, and we must continue to stand united in this House in support of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, can I also say that the thoughts of the whole House, I'm sure the whole country, will be with the family of Nicola Bulley at this very, very difficult time. And can I welcome the new member for West Lancashire to her first PMQs. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party is proud to be the party of the Good Friday Agreement and peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. We welcome attempts to make the protocol work more effectively. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it has been poorly implemented and that the basis for any deal must be removing unnecessary checks on goods?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me welcome the honourable lady to her place and associate myself with the remarks of the honourable gentleman about Nicola Bulley's family. Our thoughts are, of course, with them. As he knows, we are still in active discussions with the European Union, but he should know that I am a Conservative, a Brexiter and a Unionist, and any agreement that we reach needs to tick all three boxes. It needs to ensure sovereignty for Northern Ireland. It needs to safeguard Northern Ireland's place in our union, and it needs to find practical solutions to the problems faced by people and businesses. I will be resolute in fighting for what is best for Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree that the protocol can be improved, but there are trade-offs, and we need to face up to them. His predecessor told businesses that there would be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. That was absolute nonsense, and it destroyed trust. So in the interest of restoring that trust, will he confirm that to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, the deal he's negotiating is going to see Northern Ireland continue to follow some EU law?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the honourable gentleman is jumping ahead. We are still in intensive discussions with the European Union to ensure that we can find agreement that meets the test that I set, and that is sovereignty for Northern Ireland. It's Northern Ireland's place in our precious union, and it is to find practical solutions to the problems faced by people and businesses. I have spent time engaging and listening to those communities in Northern Ireland, businesses and political parties. I have a good understanding of what is required, and I will keep fighting until we get it.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is biting his tongue, but at some point the irreconcilables on his benches are going to twig and they're going to come after him. The former Trade Minister says there can be no role for the European Court of Justice in Northern Ireland. So will the Prime Minister be honest with them and tell them that's not going to happen?
Mr. Speaker, now again, we need to keep going to actually secure an acceptable agreement. But for the honourable gentleman to be talking about a deal that he hasn't even seen, that we are still negotiating, that isn't finalised, and it's his usual position when it comes to the European Union. It's give the EU a blank cheque and agree to anything they offer. It's not a strategy, Mr. Speaker. That's surrender.
Mr. Speaker, it's not my questions he's avoiding, it's their questions he's avoiding. His predecessors wasted months pushing the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. If implemented, it would tie us up in battles with the EU, the United States and others at precisely the time we should be building common ground to boost our economy and show unity against Putin. Now, the Prime Minister clearly wants a closer relationship with the EU. So can he confirm that if there's a deal, he will pull the protocol bill?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, look, what the honourable gentleman wants to put the EU first. I want to put Northern Ireland first. And on these questions, the honourable gentleman said he would respect the result of the referendum, and then he promised to back a second one. All the while, he was constantly voting to frustrate Brexit. And I know what the British people know, that on this question, he can't be trusted to stick up for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, the sound you hear is them cheering the Prime Minister, pulling the wool over their eyes. It's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, the 30th anniversary of the Downing Street Declaration. Tony Blair and John Major both recognise that politics in Northern Ireland is built on trust and not telling people what they want to hear, and the need to take seriously the concerns of both communities, nationalists and unionists. It's vital their voices are heard. So can the Prime Minister confirm that whatever deal he brings back, this House will get a vote on it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, Parliament will express its view. But what is crucial? What is crucial here? But what is crucial here is that this is not about his desire to play political games in this House with this situation. This is about what is best for the people and communities of Northern Ireland. And that, Mr. Speaker, is what I will keep fighting for.
Keir Starmer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I take it from that this House will get a vote, and I look forward to that vote in due course. Because everyone knows the basis of this deal has been agreed for weeks. But it's the same old story. The country has to wait while he plucks up the courage to take on the malcontents, the reckless, the wreckers on his own benches. But I'm here to tell him he doesn't need to worry about that, because we will put country before party and ensure that Labour votes to get it through. He should accept our offer, ignore the howls of indignation from those on his side who will never take yes for an answer. Why doesn't he just get on with it?
Mr. Speaker, what I am doing is talking and listening to the people of Northern Ireland. That is the right thing to do. It's to make sure that we can respond and resolve to the concerns of the unionist communities and businesses in Northern Ireland, and that is what I will keep doing. But, Mr. Speaker, we know, when the Honourable Gentleman talks about his plans, we have heard that tomorrow he's going to announce 5 missions. But we already know what they are. It's uncontrolled immigration, it's reckless spending, it's higher debt, and it's softer sentences. And for the fifth pledge, Mr. Speaker, we all know it's that he reserves the right to change his mind on the other 4.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the coroner determined that content promoted at Molly Russell that promoted self-harm and suicide contributed to her death. But they were only able to make that decision after years of campaigning by the Russell family and the coroners to gain access to that information. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that other families should not have to suffer as the Russell family have suffered, and that relevant data relevant to the death of a child should be more readily available both to families and to the coroner's service than it currently is?
Minister.
Can I join my right honourable friend in paying tribute to the Russell family for their tireless and dignified campaigning on behalf of all families who have been bereaved in such tragic circumstances. The coroners already have statutory powers to require evidence to be given or produced for the purposes of their investigation. But the government is listening carefully to the concerns of parliamentary colleagues and to bereaved families. The Ministry of Justice and Department for Science, Innovation and Technology are leading those discussions to ensure that we have the right set of procedures in place.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, wholesale gas prices have fallen by 75% since their peak. Yet in just a matter of weeks, the British government, the Westminster government, intends to increase energy bills by a further £500. What would motivate a Prime Minister to do such a thing?
Well,
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is providing tens of billions of pounds of support for people with their energy bills, particularly the most vulnerable. What we're also doing, opposed by the SNP, is to invest in producing more homegrown gas here in the UK and the North Sea. But I would say to the honourable gentleman, as one of his own, I saw, one of his own members of Parliament said this week, that if the SNP were a pizza company, their products would be slow, wrong and costly. I would say to him, it's time to focus on the issues that matter to the people of Scotland, and producing more energy is absolutely one of them.
Stephen Flynn.
I'm not sure that inferring that energy bills, Mr. Speaker, don't matter to the people of Scotland is a winning strategy for this Prime Minister. But let's get real. The fact that wholesale gas prices have fallen by 75% means a windfall to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of around £15 billion. So what they're saying, as it stands, is that they intend to raid the pockets of ordinary Scots whilst lining the pockets of Westminster. Mr. Speaker, it's time to set aside, any notion of an energy price increase to instead protect households and perhaps reduce bills by £500. Does he not agree?
Mr. Speaker, we're saving households across the United Kingdom, including in Scotland, £900 with their energy bills as a result of our energy bills guarantee. And in the coming years, we will spend £12 billion protecting particularly the most vulnerable families, pensioners across the United Kingdom. But the best way to reduce people's bills is to halve inflation, as we have promised to do, and it is to produce more homegrown energy here in the United Kingdom. That's something that this government supports. Maybe he could confirm whether the SNP supports that.
Jerome Mayor.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was well aware of the dogged campaign of the Honourable Member for North West Norfolk for a rebuild of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn. It's a hospital constructed from failing aerated concrete, where ceilings are now supported by more than 3,000 wooden and metal props. But is the Prime Minister also aware of the strength of feeling locally in support of the rebuild, not just in North West Norfolk, but in Broadland, North Norfolk, Norwich North, Mid Norfolk, South West Norfolk, Huntingdon, North West Cambridgeshire and South Holland and the Deeplings, whose populations are all served by this hospital? Will he support our campaign?
Can I thank my honourable friend and indeed my honourable friend from North West Norfolk, because I know they are great supporters of this project, and I know over the last year or so the Queen Elizabeth Hospital has been allocated over £50 million to address the most immediate issues at the site, but I also know they have expressed their interest in being part of the new hospital programme. The department is looking through all those bids. He'll know that I can't comment on specific ones, but the selected hospitals will be announced in due course.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for his efforts in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It is unacceptable that Northern Ireland has been put in this place with a protocol imposed upon us that harms our place in the United Kingdom. It must be replaced with arrangements that are acceptable and restore our place in the United Kingdom and its internal market. Does the Prime Minister accept how important the constitutional and democratic issues are in relation to getting a solution? And will he agree with me that it is unacceptable that EU laws are imposed on Northern Ireland with no democratic scrutiny or consent? And will he assure me that he will address these fundamental constitutional issues and do so not just by tweaking the protocol, but by rewriting the legally binding treaty text?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question, but also thank him for the role that he has played in recent months in articulating unionist concerns. I have heard loud and clear when he says he wants and needs these issues resolved so that he has a basis to work with others to restore power sharing, and I know that that is genuine. He raised a question of practical issues, and it is vital that these are addressed. But he also raises, Mr. Speaker, a vital question about the constitutional and legal framework in which these arrangements exist. And I can assure him that I agree. Addressing the democratic deficit is an essential part of the negotiations that remain ongoing with the European Union. And just as he has been consistent, so have I. And I can assure him that this is at the very heart of the issues that must be addressed.
Mr. McVeigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has made fixing illegal immigration across the Channel one of his key top priorities. He's also said that legislation will be required to stop it. I completely agree. So, can he tell us when we can expect to see this legislation coming forward, as time is of the essence? And can he explain why sorting out this issue did not feature on the Home Office Permanent Secretary's stated top 3 priorities for his department?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank my honourable friend for her question. She's right. Illegal crossings put people's lives at risk. It diverts resources away from those in genuine need, and it's unfair on those who migrate here legally. And that's why one of our 5 pledges to the British people is to stop the boats. We are working at pace on the legislation. It's important that it works. And in the meantime, our deals with Albania and France are already yielding benefits. But what I can tell her is that we want a system whereby if someone arrives in our country illegally, they will not be able to stay. Instead, they will be detained and removed to a country that they come from or a safe third alternative. That is the system that the Home Secretary and I are working hard to put in place, and that is what our legislation will deliver.
How about G. Signesi?
Thank you, Roger. Mr. Speaker, thanks to the Prime Minister's policies, we are now inflicted with the highest tax burden and the biggest drop in disposable income since the Second World War. And to make matters worse, tens of billions of pounds of taxpayer money was wasted on a world-beating test and trace system, billions on PPE that wasn't even fit for purpose, not to mention the endless list of crony COVID contracts going to Tory chums who profiteered at the expense of other people's misery. So when will the Prime Minister help us to recover some of that lost money so that striking nurses, teachers and other public servants can be paid the decent wage that they so richly deserve?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that the government is in intensive talks with the Royal College of Nursing to find a way forward. As I've always said, we are keen to discuss these terms and conditions, and I'm glad that those conversations are now happening. What I'd say to the honourable gentleman is he really cares about the impact of working people, then maybe him and his party should stand up to their union paymasters and back our minimum service laws.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his support in the launch of the new regulatory reform group. Would the Prime Minister commit to working with our group in 2 specific areas? The first, to improve the accountability and responsiveness of our regulators to both stakeholders and to Parliament, and secondly, to improve the economic potential in key growing areas of the economy, such as financial services, artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing.
Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and he's right about the importance of getting our regulatory framework right to drive growth and prosperity. That's why my honourable friend, the Chancellor, has set out an extensive review of retained EU law in 5 key growth areas, including life sciences, green industries and digital technology. But also, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor is leading work to consider how the UK can better regulate emerging technologies, enabling their rapid and safe introduction.
And David.
It was a pleasure to meet the delegation from Kyiv before questions and to confirm that across this House we are united in our support for Ukraine and its brave heroes. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative manifesto promised 40 new hospitals. After 3 years, most of these hospitals haven't even got planning permission yet. And communities feel betrayed and taken for granted. As ITV showed yesterday, St Helier Hospital in South London is literally crumbling, but there's still no plan to save it. Hinchingbrook Hospital in Cambridgeshire has sewage leaking into its wards and a roof that could collapse at any moment. Does the Prime Minister agree that these are conditions no patients, doctors or nurses should have to put up with? Can he tell the House...
Prime Minister, just before we do, please don't take advantage of the order paper for others. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we're investing record sums into the NHS under this government, also record sums in NHS Capital, not just going on upgrading almost 100 hospitals, developing 40 large-scale developments, as the Honourable Gentleman knows, but also investing in more scanners, more ambulances across the board so we can deliver vital care to people. And I'm very pleased that the most recent statistics on urgent emergency care show considerable improvement from the challenges we faced over December, and we now are on a clear path to getting people the treatment they need in the time that they need it.
Theo Clark.
I welcome the government's commitment to tackling illegal migration and particularly the issue of small boats. But can I ask my right honourable friend if he will reconsider the government's proposal to relocate approximately 500 single male asylum seekers to Beaconside in Stafford? And can I ask him to meet with me urgently to discuss this, given the huge amount of objections I've received from constituents on this issue?
Prime Minister.
Well, firstly, Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my honourable friend back to her place? And I know that this is an issue that is concerning her and her constituents, and it's why we must absolutely stop the boats and stem the tide of illegal migrants to relieve this pressure on our local communities. But I will ensure that she meets with the Home Secretary as soon as possible to discuss her concerns, and hopefully we can arrange that meeting in the coming days.
John McNulty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month, the Scottish Child Payment marks its 2-year anniversary. In a cost of living crisis, this policy has been a lifeline to hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland. Therefore, will the Prime Minister follow the leadership of the Scottish Government and introduce an equivalent child payment?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the best way to ensure that children grow up not in poverty is to make sure they grow up in a workless household. And that's why I'm proud that under the record of the Conservative government, there are almost 1 million fewer children growing up in workless households, hundreds of thousands fewer children in poverty. And that's because this government is on the side of parents and will make sure that they have the jobs they need, because ultimately that is the best poverty strategy, is to have everybody in work.
David Mundell.
Mr. Speaker, I've previously called out in this House the appalling level of service that my constituents and yours received from train operator TransPennine. Last month, TransPennine had the largest number of cancellations of any service provider in the UK, but it turns out that even this figure was fiddled, because TransPennine had cancelled over 1,000 trains before 10:30 the night before, so that they don't show up in the statistics. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this practice is totally unacceptable, as is their level of service?
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend. The current service levels are unacceptable. The Rail North Partnership, which is managing the contract, is working with the company on an improvement plan. My honourable friend, the Rail Minister, is having weekly meetings with Rail North Partnership to monitor its progress. And whilst the TransPennine contract expires in May, and we are working on a new contract, if ministers conclude that the operator cannot be turned around, then other decisions may have to be made.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of the 40 promised new hospitals referred to by my right honourable friend, 11 of those are in the southwest of England. 3 of them surround my constituency in Barnstaple, Dorchester and Taunton, but none of them has planning permission. It's been reported that staff at Eastbourne District General Hospital were told that their town would not get a new hospital and that it was, quote, a barefaced lie. Given that the Prime Minister claims his mandate rests on a manifesto that promised 40 new hospitals, when will we see them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to building 40 new hospitals as part of the new hospital programme. In the southwest, 8 out of the 11 schemes do have full outline planning permission approved, and the remaining 3 schemes, due to when they are due to be delivered, would not be expected to have planning permission at this stage, and we're working with the Trust to go through that process. So everything is on track, and we will bring those hospitals to the people in the southwest.
Stevenson.
million sent to Wolverhampton to trial the new Better Health app, which will support Wolfrunians make better choices about their diet and fitness. Will he welcome this and also celebrate our grassroots sports clubs in Wolverhampton, especially Wentzfield Aces Cycle Speedway Club, who celebrated their Diamond Jubilee last year?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I join my honourable friend in commending all her local sporting organisations for the job they do? And she's absolutely right. That prevention is absolutely better than a cure, and ensuring that we can support people to live healthy, fulfilling lives is absolutely part of our plan. And that's why we're investing in football pitches, tennis courts and youth facilities right up and down the country. And I'm glad that her constituents are benefiting.
Ellen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government hasn't only broken its promises on new hospitals, it's also broken its pledge of 6,000 more doctors, with the number of qualified GPs having actually fallen. GPs in Shropshire are seeing 400 more patients each than they were in 2016, which is one of the biggest rises in the country. Places across the country, East Sussex, Devon, Cambridgeshire and Hampshire, have also seen the number of qualified GPs fall. When will the Prime Minister end his government's neglect of local health services and recruit and retain the GPs we need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the facts of this, there are 2,200 more GPs in general practice today. There are 15,000 more doctors in the NHS, and there are 30,000 more nurses. And that's because we're putting record funding in and backing the NHS and getting patients the care that they need.
Sir Robert Matlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend in grasping the nettle and seeking to negotiate an agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Yeah.
Does he share my frustration with the express views of people who are commenting upon a deal that has yet to be reached? And does he agree with me that the best way to reduce or even end the jurisdiction of the CJEU is through treaty change itself and not through domestic legislation in this Parliament?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. We need to keep going, but he's also right that we need to find enduring solutions to the challenges faced by the people of Northern Ireland, and that's why, as my right honourable friend mentioned earlier, it is absolutely right that we address the constitutional and legal framework of our arrangements and ensure that we can put in place new arrangements that secure Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is no stranger to paying fines, but last week the £2.3 billion he paid to the EU after the UK government allowed Chinese fraudsters to flood Europe with cheap goods is the worst waste of public money. My question is simple. If he can find £2.3 billion to pay a fine, why can't he pay NHS workers and others the pay increases they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, he may not have seen that the Royal College of Nursing are now in talks with the government about resolving the disputes, and I'm grateful to them. I'm grateful to them for entering to those talks with a spirit of a constructive attitude, but also to calling off their strikes next week. What I would urge him and his colleagues to do is be on the side of working people, and that's to back our laws to introduce minimum safety levels across the NHS and transport, because that's the best way to demonstrate that you're on the side of hard-working families, Mr. Speaker.
Bill Wiggett.
Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly support my Prime Minister's priority to stop the boats. So could he please bring in the small boats bill next week?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his support. I share with him the same desire, which is to stop the boats for all the reasons that we've discussed in this session. And he should rest assured that the Home Secretary and I are working intensely and as quickly as possible to bring forward that legislation, because what I want is what he wants, is to ensure that those people who come here illegally will simply not be allowed to stay.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During recess, my community in Warrington was rocked by the murder of 16-year-old schoolgirl Brianna Jai. What support will the Prime Minister offer to our community and to our local schools in order to ensure that they have the support that they need to support Brianna's classmates and her family as we try to heal from this appalling tragedy?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the honourable lady for raising this issue and express my sympathies to Rihanna's family and friends for what's happened. I know she will be playing her part in her local community in supporting them at this difficult time. I know the Home Secretary is shortly due to visit the area, and she will be able to discuss with the honourable lady what support can be provided to support the community at a time like this, and she should know that she will have what she needs from the government.
Final question, Anthony Magnum.
Mr. Speaker, I can't ask the Prime Minister to stop time or tide, but I might ask him to offset it, because in South Devon the Slapton line is being eroded away, and I need him to help me lobby the Department for Transport and the DEFRA Secretary to see that we can get the repairs done, because Natural England is standing in the way of this vital link and stopping us from doing the developments that we need to do. Will he support me?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a fantastic campaigner and advocate for his constituents. I know that this particular issue is causing frustration and concern in his community. He's absolutely right to raise it. I will ensure that he gets the appropriate meetings he needs with the ministers in question so we can work with him to try and find a resolution.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
That brings us to the end of this week's session of Prime Minister's Questions. As always, we have new guests on Politics Live. Let me introduce them to you. Maria Caulfield for the Government, a Health Minister, Stephen Kinnock for Labour, Shadow Immigration, and my colleague Nick Eardley, the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent. Welcome to all of you. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Nick, if I start with you, Keir Starmer, all of his questions were about the trading arrangements that have guided Northern Ireland since the UK has left the EU. The Northern Ireland Protocol, as it's called, to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, we were told that a deal was going to be announced this week, a new deal, a revised deal of those arrangements. We still haven't seen anything. Did we learn anything from that session?
I'm not sure we learnt much from the exchanges with Keir Starmer. I think the Prime Minister was doing everything he could not to give away any specifics, but that exchange with the DUP leader, Jeffrey Donaldson, was particularly interesting because Rishi Sunak talked about that idea of addressing some of the democratic accountability that the DUP have talked a lot about, which hints that Rishi Sunak is hoping to, when he finally comes up with this deal, tell us something about how Stormont would have a role in this process. It's hard to see at the moment how it would meet that demand that the DUP have, that laws the Northern Ireland has to follow are not set by the EU, because that terrible phrase, dynamic alignment, means that they will be.
I'd almost forgotten about that phrase. Rishi Sunak did also say that Parliament will express its view, I think were the words he used. Does that mean there is going to be a vote by MPs on whatever agreement is made?
I'm not certain. It sounded a bit like he was hinting at it without quite saying it.
Well,
don't see how you wouldn't end up with some vote of some sort. I imagine Stephen's party might want to force one if the Prime Minister doesn't allow one.
I mean, should there be a vote on whatever the Prime Minister brings back, Maria Caulfield?
Well, I think let's see what the Prime Minister does bring back, because he was very clear that the deal hasn't been fully agreed yet, and so we need to see what the level of detail is.
But when it does, should there be a vote?
Well, I don't know if there should be a vote. I think, as the Prime Minister said, Parliament will have its say. It will be debated, that's for sure, and there are ways to have votes. So we need to see what the mechanism of that is. But I thought what was very interesting was that the Labour Party don't seem to really have changed their tack on this from the Brexit days, in terms of they will vote anything through just to kind of keep the EU on side. And what is so important in all of this is, in terms of what the DUP is asking, the implications of not sorting this out properly is there is no executive, no functioning assembly in Northern Ireland, and devolved issues like health, education, police are not being dealt with. And that's why it's so important. It's not just a tick box exercise to get the protocol sorted.
Right.
This is about real issues in Northern Ireland.
So should the Prime Minister have got the agreement of the Democratic Unionist Party and its leader Jeffrey Donaldson before embarking on talks with the EU?
I think he needs to get everyone involved, and I think absolutely it's crucial.
Yeah, but he hadn't done, had he, up until now? I mean, it was pretty stark listening to Jeffrey Donaldson. Do you agree with him? It would be unacceptable if Northern Ireland continues to be guided in any way on a legal basis by the laws of the EU.
Well, I think the Prime Minister recognises that that's what the position of the protocol right now.
Do you agree with Jeffrey Donaldson? Would you accept a deal that comes back from Rishi Sunak that he's agreed with Maros Sefcovic in the EU that still has the EU guiding some of the customs, some of the regulations, and the European Court of Justice as the final arbiter?
I think the Prime Minister actually hinted at this himself. He said he wants to address those constitutional and democratic issues. And I took from that he takes the DUP's concerns very seriously, and that's part of the work that he's doing with the deal.
I'm really interested that the thing you brought up as an example of what needs to happen here is to get Stormont up and running again. So if the DUP don't, as a result of this deal, agree to power sharing again, is it a failure?
Well, I think it's a failure for the people of Northern Ireland that there isn't a functioning assembly.
You've set yourself a bit of a bar there by saying we need to get Stormont back up and running. That's why we're doing this whole thing. If the DUP turn round and say this isn't enough for us to go back into power sharing, that suggests that the government has failed.
Well, I don't think it suggests that the government has failed. I think it shows that why this government's taking this so importantly, that this is such a priority for the Prime Minister, because it's not just about the actual day-to-day Northern Ireland Protocol issues about goods moving back and forth. It's actually about, it is about that, but it's also about getting democracy back to Northern Ireland and trying to sort out that power sharing agreement. We know the DUP won't go back till the Northern Ireland Protocol's been sorted, and it's so important that for devolved matters, whether it's health, education, policing, that is up and running. And that's why it's such a priority for the Prime Minister.
So it isn't going to be enough, is it, to sort out the technical issues, as you say, the trading issues, the talk of a red lane and a green lane, so that goods heading for Northern Ireland have far fewer checks, goods headed for the EU, Ireland, will have far more checks. It isn't about that, is it? It's only really about the constitutional issue. And therefore, why did you and others sign up to it in the first place? Because it was very clear what the constitutional issue was.
It's absolutely also about the trading arrangement.
But I think that's been done. I think we get the impression that's been done.
Well, I haven't seen the deal.
Well,
let's say none of us have.
But let's say it has been done. It's not going to be enough, is it?
Well, I think that's why the Prime Minister hasn't announced a deal. He is still in negotiations. Be very clear about that. He wants the absolute best deal for Northern Ireland. And it's, what I found understanding from Keir Starmer was that he would accept anything. Just, get it out of the way. It doesn't matter the implications. It doesn't matter whether it actually helps Northern Ireland. Just get a deal through.
Well, you're shaking your head. That is what Keir Starmer has said. The Labour Party's just given a blank cheque. He's just said it again today. Don't worry. If you haven't got the support of perhaps Maria Caulfield and others within your own party and behind you on the benches, but we'll be there.
Of course, a deal comes forward, we look at that deal, but if the deal has been done between the European Union and the UK government and the parties in Northern Ireland support it, then we have to assume
but what if the Democratic
we would support.
But if the Democratic Unionist Party says no, we don't support it because we've still got laws being guided, maybe to a lesser extent, by the EU, would you support it?
Well, we have to have a compromise in all of this. This is a situation which is messy. The inevitable implications of Brexit is that it has an impact on the borders, either down the Irish Sea or the land border. The number one priority is to protect the Good Friday Agreement. That is why Keir Starmer has so passionately put forward the case for compromise, because that's the only way any of us are going to get out of this. The reality is there is a Brexit purist cult on the backbenches of the Conservative Party, and they are trying to block this deal because the Prime Minister is also so weak. I mean, what a stark illustration of just how weak he is. Keir Starmer is saying, let's put country before party. Let's put the national interest ahead of trying to play all of these party politics, trying to keep these people happy. You, as he said, never take yes for an answer, and that's why Labour is offering the Prime Minister our support to get this deal over the line.
Well, how is it putting country before party when you would agree any deal that wouldn't resolve the issues in Northern Ireland?
But it's the deal the Prime Minister brings. We're not agreeing any deal. The only deal that we'll get a vote on is the Prime Minister's deal.
Keir Starmer has just said he will vote for anything. He said, bring it on. What's the delay? He wants the Prime Minister just to accept anything. The Prime Minister's really focused that whatever we do to the Northern Ireland Protocol...
Are you not going to support the Prime Minister's deal, then?
Well, absolutely. But Keir Starmer said at the dispatch box just now to the Prime Minister, Bring anything back. It doesn't matter what it's there.
Bring a proposal, and we vote on the proposal the Prime Minister
It
brings.
has to be the right
It's
proposal.
It's an utterly absurd
It has to be the right. If you bring a deal to Parliament,
if the Prime Minister brings a deal to Parliament.
No, this is what Keir Starmer's suggesting. Bring any deal to Parliament. Doesn't matter what it's in it.
He's saying to the Prime Minister, bring a deal to Parliament.
If that doesn't bring the DUP back to power sharing in Northern Ireland, that does not benefit the people in Northern Ireland. That's why the Prime Minister is taking the time and the effort to bring everyone together.
Whose deal would we be voting on in Parliament? Would it be the Prime Minister's deal?
Well, absolutely, but that's why he's taking the time to do that.
That's what Labour is saying, is we will look at the Prime
You've
Minister's
just said,
deal.
Bring any deal back. It doesn't matter what's in it.
We're not in government. The Prime Minister is doing the negotiations with the DUP and everybody else, making a hash of it. But hopefully at some point he will bring a deal forward and we are ready to vote on that deal.
Whatever's in it?
We're not. No, we will vote on what the Prime Minister brings forward.
Well, let me just get back to this, the deal as it comes back. Are you saying that the Prime Minister could come back with a deal that doesn't necessarily meet all the tests set by the Democratic Unionist Party and wouldn't lead to a restoration of Stormont?
No, I think the Prime Minister has been very clear this afternoon.
So he has to do that?
He's been very clear that he wants to bring everyone together and he's going to take the time and space to get to do that. Right.
OK, but there would have to be a compromise somewhere. So are you saying that you wouldn't have a border down the Irish Sea? There has to be, according to the EU, some sort of external border. And in order to bring the Democratic Unionist Party back into power sharing in Stormont, would you have a border between Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland?
Well, I think those sorts of issues... I mean, I haven't been involved in the negotiations, but from what Geoffrey Donaldson was saying, they're not the main issues that he's got in terms of the movement of goods. His main concern is about the European Court of Justice and being under EU rules. And that's, I think, where the negotiations are going at the moment. The movement of goods, I think, you know, as you said yourself, it sounds like that has been bottomed out, but there are still issues that need to be dealt with.
How difficult is this for Rishi Sunak? I mean, how dangerous a moment is this in terms of rerunning or echoing those Brexit wars when Theresa May was Prime Minister?
Well, look, I can't say with any certainty just how many Tory MPs would be prepared to rebel on this, but what I can say is speaking to senior Brexiteers, the ones who are really exercised by what we know is in the deal, are very, very adamant that they won't back it as it stands, and they think they have dozens of colleagues who are in a similar place. Again, I've not spoken to any ministers who are threatening to resign, but Brexiteers keep talking about there being ministers who are prepared to stand by their values on this. And in that sense, I think it's a real test of Rishi Sunak. If he tries to push this through without the DUP's backing, there will be a big rebellion in his own party. Just how big and just what exactly that means for him will depend on the size.
Would it be a resignation issue for you?
No, I don't. You know, there is no deal that we are.
No. But could it be? Could it be if red lines are crossed for you? You were pretty staunchly in favour of Brexit.
No, absolutely. But I think we have to recognise the protocol doesn't work now. It doesn't work for the people of Northern Ireland. There is a difference.
Well, it doesn't work for the Democratic Unionist Party.
It doesn't work. That GB is different to Northern Ireland, and I welcome that the Prime Minister is trying to sort that out. So for me, you know, there will be an improvement, and so I welcome that move that he sees the priority. He sees the consequences of the protocol not working. All right. He wants to sort that out.
Another very big issue that has been ongoing for the past few months is the issue of strikes and the issue of pay for various sectors. Nick, now we had the news yesterday, somewhat surprisingly actually, the nurses had announced they were going to pause their strike action next week because the government, with the intervention of Rishi Sunak, has agreed to intervene and intensive talks. Is there going to be a deal?
Not sure. Again, I think there's much more of an opportunity for one, certainly when it comes to nurses, because the government is prepared now, after weeks and weeks and weeks of saying it wouldn't, to look again at the 2022-2023 pay deal, the thing the unions have always asked. I think there's still a ceiling on what they'd be prepared to offer, which is probably about 5%, because that's the point at which the Treasury reckons it would make inflation more problematic, although that's contested. The one thing that I think is on the table in the talks that are happening this morning, Maria, maybe you can confirm it for us, is the idea of backdating next year's pay deal by a few months to compensate for those cost of living pressures.
So I'm not going to comment on the negotiations because they are, the Secretary of State is heavily involved with the RCN now. And I think, we need to give them the space and time to do that. But I really welcome that the RCN, I think Pat Cullen has acted really responsibly in calling off the strikes to get back round the table and try and sort it out. It's what she's done in Scotland in terms of calling off the strikes there.
Yeah, well, that's because they've offered something in the region of 6.5%. I mean, the point is, why the change of heart by the government?
Well, it's not a change of heart. The door has been open on pay, and we've
on this year's pay,
yeah,
but not or next year's pay, I should say. But the nurses were very insistent. It should look at the year to date, last year's pay settlement. Why the change of heart by the government?
Well, the change of heart is that we want, we have been clear that pay is on the table, and we want to discuss that, and we want to end the strikes because it's in no one's interest for strikes to be ongoing, particularly for patients. And I think it's welcome that there is, serious negotiations going on right now.
Something you must welcome too.
Better late than never. The big question is why it's dragged on for so long. It really feels like patients have been used as bargaining chips by the government. The government should have been getting round the table with these key workers. We stood on our doorsteps and applauded the nurses through COVID, and I think that it's pretty disgraceful, really, that it's taken this long to get to the negotiating table.
There's strikes in Labour-run Wales as well, and they've not resolved those. So this is happening in all 4 nations.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the funding settlement that the Welsh Government gets from the UK Government is based on a £3 billion real terms cut since 2010. So we've only got the bargaining tools that we've got to work with.
Well,
but
not,
it's good
not only
news.
in that sense. There are things the Welsh Government could
raise
do.
taxes.
Well, no, because there's no the progressive taxation that we want to have. There isn't a strong enough tax base for the top rate of taxpayers in Wales. That's the reality of the Welsh economy.
Would you support, a Labour government support 6.5%, as has been offered in Scotland in terms of a pay rise for nurses?
I'm not going to get into the details of the negotiations. What I simply say is there's a basic duty for government, which is to get around the table and work in partnership rather than this constant confrontational, stirring the pot, looking to stoke culture wars, which I think is what the government's tried to do with the strikes. They have failed. It's good that they're now taking a more pragmatic approach.
I mean, the strikes have worked, haven't they? Maria, in the end, the government has finally seen sense and is saying we will talk about pay, not just this year, but last year.
Well, I do think the strikes have worked. I think they've done a huge amount of damage to patients, and I think that's why...
They've worked with the government, haven't they?
Well, not necessarily. The negotiations are happening, but there's a range of strikes happening. We're not going to, for example, the BMA's demand of a 26%...
That's for junior doctors.
Junior doctors. That's not achievable or realistic. And
what would be achievable and realistic?
Well, junior doctors are in a different position in that they're not under the independent pay review body. They have a multi-year settlement, which is 8.4%.
And lots of them are going to live in Australia.
Which, the unions themselves signed up to. And I don't think striking does mean that that pay in terms of an increase is guaranteed. Negotiations is the way to get this resolved.
Is there a special case for nurses, Maria? I mean, you're a health minister, you're a former nurse. Are there a special case?
I mean, I have to be very careful here because I am both an RCN member and a member of the government. So I wouldn't be involved in the negotiations because I've got a foot in both camps.
No, but do you think they are a special case compared to, you've mentioned junior doctors, compared to the rail drivers and railway staff, teachers? Are they a special case?
I'm not sure that nurses per se are a special case because when you look at the health service, there are so many key workers that make such a difference, whether it's the cleaners, the porters, the security staff, the doctors, the physios, OT. So what we have to be mindful with the nursing negotiation, and I'm not involved in the negotiation, is they come under what's called agenda for change. And if you change agenda for change for nurses, there are implications that the physios, the OTs are also under agenda for change. So it wouldn't be necessary that nurses are a special case. That's the cost.
Right.
So if you put up nursing by 1% on agenda for change, that's agenda for change across the board.
Are they a special case, nurses? You mentioned the pandemic, of course, and the key role they played, and the clapping for healthcare workers in general. Do you think they hold a special place in people's hearts and therefore should be treated differently on pay?
Working people across our economy deserve fair pay and good terms
Well,
and
everyone would
conditions.
agree with that. It's what fair pay
economy.
is. But do you think nurses are a special case?
I think that working people right across the board deserve a fair deal. Of course, what we should be doing is scrapping non-dom tax status to generate £2.3 billion for the Exchequer, which would be used to recruit under Labour's policy tens of thousands more doctors and
but just
medical
on that
staff.
Point, Stephen, that
so
2 point...
that is actually a choice.
Non-dom money...
Do you support non-doms or do you support nurses? It's a very simple question. Politics is about choices.
But the non-dom money, Wes Streeting wants to renationalise GPs and buy out all partners and make them nationalised. That wouldn't even touch the surface of the non-dom money. So this nonsense that non-dom's money would pay for pay rises for healthcare workers, it's been spent about 10 times over.
What I just said, it's for recruiting. One of the big problems is morale in the NHS. There's 150,000 vacancies, so nurses are under the cosh because of the abject failure of the government since 2010. But the 2.3 billion pounds, the 2.3 billion pounds is for recruiting more staff. That's what I've just said.
How are you going to pay for the GPs taking them out of their business, their practices and nationalising them?
Well, look, we need root and branch reform. We need root and branch reform across the NHS.
How are you going to pay
Wes has made it very clear. He said some very interesting things, I think, about making GP surgeries one-stop shops, but there's a fundamental issue around recruitment and retention, and if you choose nurses over non-doms, that's what's
and non-doms. So you
income.
keep saying non-doms. We should say people not domiciled here for tax purposes, which you say would raise £2.3 billion.
Yes.
In terms of the sorts of pay rises that are being demanded, that would still be a drop in the ocean. I mean, it's a significant amount of money, I agree, but it is a drop in the ocean. And there is, of course, as you know, the argument that actually people on non-dom status, not domiciled here for tax purposes, bring in other streams of revenue that help the Exchequer. Do you accept all of that?
There's no evidence at all that abolishing non-dom tax status would lead to the exodus that others talk about. On the point about pay, we need a pay settlement which keeps pace with inflation. If you look at the way public sector workers have had their pay cut massively since 2010, we've got to do something to help those people to keep up with inflation and the cost of living. But naming a percentage, it's not my job to sit here and do that. That's about getting around the table and having a mature approach.
You mentioned inflation. What would it do to inflation? I mean, the government has said that's its sort of core mission. What would pay rises at the level of inflation or above do to prices?
There's no evidence that pay rises below the rate of inflation drive inflation up, particularly for public sector pay. What we're also seeing is the knock-on impact of the war in Ukraine and COVID and supply chain issues is starting to wash through the system. So inflation is actually dropping on its own. Nothing to do with the government, it's just external factors. So as inflation drops, as we, I hope, get a more structured dialogue between the government and public sector workers, we will actually, I hope, be able to get to a better place.
Let's talk about immigration or small boats, as a number of your Conservative colleagues raised this issue. In fact, they seem to be putting Rishi Sunak under a certain amount of pressure. Esther McVey, a former cabinet minister, asking where this legislation is. Where is it, Maria?
So I think the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary are working on legislation which will be challenged. Let's not kid ourselves when it comes through, as we've seen with the plan for Rwanda, when we've tried to deport, even criminal people who've been, in prison. We want to deport them afterwards. Every time there's a legal challenge to the work that's been done. So both the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary want to make sure that the legislation comes forward, works from day one, and that's why they're taking some time over.
Unlike the Rwanda plan, which is if people arrive on a small boat, claiming asylum, they'll have their asylum applications processed in Rwanda. And how many people have gone?
Well, that's because it's been challenged in the courts and opposed by the Labour Party. That's why we want to get this right. But there is an urgency about this. There's no doubt that MPs in their constituencies, when we've got hotels with illegal immigrants waiting to be processed, when we're seeing small boats arriving on our shores, of course MPs are concerned about that. They're hearing it from their constituents and they do want the government to take action.
This is your brief, shadow immigration. Stephen, do you agree with Rishi Sunak that it's working, the deals with Albania? This is particularly with the government there about returning people as they see them as economic migrants rather than asylum seekers, and France?
The Albania deal is something that actually was first struck by a Labour government back in the day, and it's good to see that that's finally been put back in place. I think the fundamental point here is that this new piece of legislation that they're all talking about isn't necessary. We had the Nationality and Borders Bill passed back in the summer, hundreds of pages of legislation, and now they're talking about bringing forward a new piece of legislation.
So what would you do?
It's a gimmick, and it's about chasing headlines rather than doing the nitty-gritty work. That means clearing the backlog, getting the right caseworkers and decision makers into...
At least it's a plan, is what people will say. At least it's a plan to tackle something that seems to be a very big issue for many, many people.
The government's completely lost control of our asylum system. They've had 13 years. We've seen the number of small boat crossings going through the roof. Labour's plan is to resource the NCA properly by scrapping the unworkable Rwanda plan,
the NCA,
the National Crime Agency,
yes,
so that you bring in 100 new experts in a specialist unit that will actually break the people smugglers upstream. It is to bring in decision makers and caseworkers to the Home Office so we can actually start to clear the backlog, because of the backlog that we have people in inappropriate and extremely expensive hotel accommodation. It's about nitty-gritty, doing the hard yards, rather than chasing headlines in tabloid newspapers.
Well, you've had 13 years to deal with
13 years.
Well, the Labour's plan is about processing people quicker. The Prime Minister's plan is to stop the boats in the first place, and I think that's the difference. And I think that's certainly what constituents, when I'm knocking on doors, are saying to me, that, you know, we need to stop the process, not process people quicker, but end the small boats legally landing.
The backlog is acting as a magnet. One of the reasons that people are paying
the Prime Minister has promised, as one of his 5-point
because they know that if they get over
the backlog by the end of the year.
If they get over the channel, they're stuck in the completely dysfunctional asylum system for, on average, 400 days.
Do you think we're going to see this legislation anytime soon?
Well, look, I mean, there's definitely been some complications to it. There are some Tory MPs absolutely desperate to see it, particularly before the local elections, because they want something to sell to their voters. We know that the Prime Minister has talked about going to visit President Macron in Paris soon, and I suspect that that will be high on the agenda there, because a big part of whatever the government's strategy on stopping small boats is going to be is going to have to be some closer relationships with Paris. But at the moment, don't have a date for it at all.
Right. I mean, in terms of the backlog, I mean, the government has said it will clear the backlog. I mean, it's a huge backlog of asylum applications by the end of the year. You'd obviously welcome that.
They're going to do what you're... get on and do it, rather than bringing forward new pieces of legislation that aren't necessary. Implement, do the hard yards, do the nitty-gritty work, rather than chasing headlines.
It's been a failure, hasn't it, really, by successive governments? Because the numbers just have gone up, despite promises to bring them down. The small boats still come. You've tried to, well, you have made it illegal for people to use that as a means. Where's the success?
You know, I think the Prime Minister recognises that. That's why he's put it as one of his top 5 priorities, that we haven't dealt with it, but he's determined to fix that.
Thank you very much to Maria Caulfield, Stephen Kinnock, and, of course, to Nick Eardley. That's all we have time for. I will be back with more Politics Live. You'll be delighted to hear tomorrow at 12:15 on BBC Two and on the iPlayer. Bye-bye.